This Flows Fundamentals class is all about painting fabric and clothing. So during this class, I will talk about and I will show you how you can approach painting different types of fabric. And as always, it's all about observing. And in the second half of the class, I will do a little demonstration and I will be painting 2 different types of clothing. Of course, I have attached the exercise files and I have left a link to my Pinterest board where you can find lots of reference images so you can keep on practicing and strengthen those fabric painting muscles. It took me quite a while, to be honest, to prepare for this class because there are so many different types of fabric and they all have their own challenges. Like this one, for example, that I have just created for the introductory image thing. It is quite translucent, so I had to make multiple layers, add transparency, and in the end I used some glitter brushes actually to add those little sparkles. But let's just get started and talk about how we can break down fabric and translate it to our artwork. So the first thing we'll do is observe. Fabric can have different characteristics. For example, the thickness of the fabric can vary. Here on the left side you see a pretty thick fabric, and on the right side you see a thinner type of fabric. And when you observe, try to think how you know that this one is thick and this one is thin, because you probably know, but how do you know? Well, it's the folds that give it away. You can see that this left one, it has pretty thick looking folds. You can see it right here near the arms where we have very, thick folds, and here in the middle as well. But on the right side where you have that thin fabric, you can see these very thin looking folds. And here at the bottom as well, where it's going over the pants a bit, it's pretty thin, that little fold, where if you look at that sweater, it's pretty big, those folds. So when you are trying to paint a sweater like this, for example, keep that in mind, that it's a thick fabric and that you need thicker looking folds. Fabric also comes in a great variety of textures. So when you are trying to paint a certain type of fabric, think about that texture and how you can incorporate that in your painting. You have like these pretty smooth looking fabrics like this leather type, and this, I think it's some kind of cotton. It doesn't have a lot of texture, it looks pretty smooth. But here, for example, you can see some texture, a little bit like a sandy texture, grainy, I would add. And here we have that denim texture, of course. So when you paint denim, you definitely need to add some texture. You could use some texture brushes, for example. And here in the middle, you see that knitwear. That must be the most challenging type of texture, I guess, to paint when it comes to fabric. You can either play around with brushes or just spend a lot of time getting that knitwear texture in your clothing, in your fabric. But it's good to realize that the texture tells us something about the type of fabric. Then we have the reflectiveness of the fabric. That can vary as well. Here, the first image, you can see that this fabric, this denim fabric, it isn't reflective at all. So you don't see any bright highlights. You see a very subtle transition between the light areas and the dark areas. You can see some dark shadows, but overall, it's hard to see where the shadow side and where the light side is. Then we have this like leather in the middle, and you can see that that's a bit shinier. It has more reflectiveness. The highlights aren't super bright, but you can see a clear distinction between the shadow areas and the highlight areas. But still, there's a pretty smooth transition there. And then we have this like latex clothing on the right that's very, very reflective. So there's a very distinct line between the shadows and the highlights. The highlights have pretty crisp edges, and that's what's adding, or that's what's showing that shine of the fabric. So when you're painting fabric, try to think about those highlights. Are they crisp edged? Are they very bright? Or are there more like soft transitions in the fabric? Or perhaps you don't see a lot of highlights at all, like in denim. Another thing to consider is the weight of the fabric. Gravity can pull the fabric down, but lighter fabrics don't get the same amount of pull from gravity. Here you can see this skirt. It looks pretty heavy. You can see that all the lines are like going down. You see that here, the weight is pulling, gravity is pulling on this skirt. But over here you can see a much lighter type of fabric. If this would be very heavy, then everything would be pulling down. But you can see that it is pretty light, and you can see that still, well, it's not pulling down. It's hard to explain, but I can't find the right words in English, I guess, but it's a little bit puffy. And if it would be heavy, it wouldn't be able to be this puffy. You can also see it here near the shoulder. If it would be heavy, then it would be going straight down along the shoulder and the arm. So those are also things to keep in mind when painting fabric. When you think of fabric, you also think of folds, because fabric, it folds. And let's look at these simple hanging folds. These are the folds that happen when you hang your fabric down, like with this skirt. You can see like a curvy shape, and you can try to follow just that underside of the curve and go through those, well, like those folds. Follow that line, and you can see that it's something like this, and that can help when sketching these folds, for example. So try to follow those folds first. Imagine that you could look through it, and then think about those vertical lines going up. And once you got those, you can get rid of those lines that, like here, you can see them through the fabric. You can remove those, and then you got a nice hanging fold. And to practice this, you can actually just get some reference images like this and draw on top of them to try to figure out those folds. And you also get folds where you like squish the fabric together, like here where there's a little like knot around the leg. You can see that the fabric is coming together, and then it starts to fold, and it's all like coming together in one point. You also get folds where the fabric is squished together in another way, like around elbows, or if you pull your sleeves up, all the fabric will be squished together a little bit, and you get these little folds around the arms, for example, or near the knees, wherever fabric gets squished together. Painting is really all about observing your subjects like this, trying to understand them. That's just really the first step in the painting process. And I'll show you a couple of paintings that I've created and talk you through the steps that I used. For instance, this dress, you can see that it's a pretty shiny fabric. So it has some bright highlights and also some pretty deep shadows. You can see that it's a thin fabric because of the thin folds. And it's relatively heavy. You can see the weight pulling down on it. And what I always start with is a sketch, of course. That was step 1. And you can do that in like 2 steps. I probably used 2 steps, made a rough sketch first, then lowered the opacity, and then made a new sketch on top. And getting all those folds in, getting a grip of that. And then I made a layer underneath to just paint in the base color. And then I turned Alpha Lock on that layer with just the base color, so I wouldn't be able to paint outside of the shape. And then I started using the Flotastic brush to just roughly paint in the shadow parts and the light parts of those folds. And I'll also add my Procreate file so you can take a closer look on it. And really at this stage, you don't need to worry about the details. You can keep it messy. Then in the 4th step, I started blending everything a little bit, making everything look smoother, and also deepening the shadows, working on those little crisp edges here, for example. And I mostly use the Darken and Lighten line and the Flow Darker and Flow Lighter to work on the shadows and highlights. Then in the final stage, I just tweaked things. I added brighter highlights, adding that real shine to the fabric. Because if I wouldn't have added those bright highlights, then the fabric wouldn't look as shiny as it does right now. Then some denim. I created a denim short. Again, I just started out with the sketch. And again, I made the base color underneath and turned it to alpha lock. And then I started using the Flotastic brush again to add those dark and light areas, thinking about the colors, and just roughly painting those folds in. Then in the next stage, I used some denim texture brushes that are part of my fabric brush pack. Just roughly painted some texture on it. Not too much. I kept it pretty subtle. And started refining those darker areas and those lighter areas. Just slowly building up that contrast. And again, I use the darken and lighten line and the flow dark and the flow lighter brush a lot. Because that way I could also keep that texture that I already had, keep that intact. And I didn't use the blending brush too much here. And then in the final stages, I painted some texture in by hand as well. Like here, those light little thingies. And here around that edge. And I also used the overlay brush to add some brighter blues. Spice up that color a bit. And you can see that compared to that previous image, we don't have a lot of very bright highlights here. But we do have some deep, dark shadows in these folds. These few folds that we have, they are pretty dark. Then I started drawing a skirt. And I can see that I actually forgot a fold over here. But I used that technique, thinking about those folds here at the bottom. Just trying to figure out how they work. And then again, underneath that sketch, I made the base color, turned alpha lock on, and then started working on the shadow areas and the lighter areas. And you can see that the shadows in between those folds, those shadows are pretty deep. And that's what's really giving that volume, really giving that depth to the skirt. And then I just slowly started building on that, adding darker shadows, lighter highlights. This is not a shiny fabric, so there is a smooth transition between the light areas and the dark areas. There are just a few little highlights like on that bow, on that ribbon here. And there's just a little difference between step 3 and 4. Here I added some color variation using the overlay brush, blended some areas, and it's really the tweaking phase of the painting. But again, I'll just add the working file, the Procreate file, in case you want to take a closer look. And if you do, you'll see that you can still see the brushwork. It's not perfect, but when you look from a distance, it looks like a skirt. It looks believable. Now this was a challenging fabric, a very colorful, bright fabric with lots of highlights. I just started out with a sketch. I thought I'll just see where this leads. And then I added some base colors underneath, on a layer underneath. And I decided to just go ahead, pick some bright colors. I started thinking about where I was seeing like the pinks and where I was seeing the blues. Making a nice variation of colors. Because that's really the base of this jacket. Lots of colors and then shadows and highlights can be put on top. Here I started blending the colors a bit, adding more brighter colors, using overlay to really give them a boost. I just wanted lots of color variation for this jacket. And then using like the lighten line, darken line, flow darker, flow lighter brushes, I started adding those little shadow areas and highlight areas. And just constantly keeping in mind that I needed that color variation. So if you're making something like this, don't use just one shadow color and paint that all around, but try to vary the colors to keep that color variation in your work. So for some highlights, for example, I used blue, bright blue to add the highlights, and on some areas I used pinks. And this was the final stage in which I just tweaked the highlights and the shadows, added a little like texture to that band here just by using the lighten line brush and making very little strokes. And when you look up close in the working file, you see that it still looks messy in areas, but when you look from a distance, this looks like This looks like a jacket. Another very challenging fabric is knitwear. When confronted with knitwear, don't try to get intimidated. Try not to think about the knitwear texture in the beginning. I just created a sketch first, sketching out the little flower pattern in the knitwear. Then I started painting a base color underneath, thinking about the shadows. And I wasn't working too light. It is a pretty light sweater, or I'm not sure what it's called, but you need to start with a pretty dark base. Then I started working on the colors using overlay again to add warmth to the shadows, for example. And I started slowly building up those flowers in the knitwear and those little knitties here. I also used a knitwear texture brush that is also in my fabric brush pack. You can use a texture like that on a separate layer, and then I used the warp tool and also liquify to move that texture around, and then I used a mask to mask parts of it. So there's a very subtle knitwear texture in there. It's just a subtle touch. And here I kept working on smaller and smaller details. I could actually take it even further than this, but it's just very time consuming. Again, I use those brushes that I mentioned before, like the Lighten line and Flow Darker, Flow Lighter, to slowly build that up and darken some shadows, add highlights. I used the Flow Lighter brush for these, like this pattern. Made the brush pretty big to make the pattern on top of a darker base. And those brushes, they just give you a lot of control and they will keep the texture underneath intact. But yeah, really just start with the big shapes, the shadows and the darks, and go from very rough painterly to more and more detailed. I think it's time for a little demonstration. I will be painting 2 different types of clothing, and that way I can show you how I use the brushes and how I approach painting fabric. We'll start off with this skirt. It is relatively easy, so it's a nice exercise for you. I have made a reference layer and a study layer, and I actually want to make it a bit lighter. I'm gonna go for a warmish color and go even lighter. I'll drop it in, and first let's make a sketch. I'll do that on a new layer on top. And use clipping mask just to be sure. I'll be using the Flotastic Sketcher. And first, let's think about that outline. Let me make the brush smaller. I'll think about how broad it is at the top. Got a little curve there. Then think about that angle of the fabric going down. Is that a hair on my screen? Let me blow it away. It won't go. Oh, I'll need to lift it up. No, go away. I guess I didn't clean my screen properly. Alright. Let's go back. We have this curve here at the bottom. You don't have to draw the folds yet. Just thinking about the length of the skirt. Got that bow in the middle. We got those folds. And first I'll think about spacing between the folds. I'll make these vertical lines. We got one that's almost in the middle here. You can see that it's a pretty thin fabric. You can see that because those folds are pretty thin at the top. Then we have 2 folds over here. Trying to space everything properly. We got that ribbon going to here. Another one over here. Now we got those folds here. And we can think about how it's curving in those areas where we can't really see it. It's a bit like this. And then we got those lines going up. Here we got that edge where the light is hitting. Here we got a shadow area in between these two folds. Feel like we need to move this one out just a little bit. And of course you could make a second sketch. You can lower the opacity of this one and then sketch on top to make a more tidy sketch. But I just want to get started painting. So let's make a new layer. Or you know, let me just paint straight. No, I won't be painting straight on it. Let me make multiple groups so you can see my steps. I'm going to make a new layer here on top. And I'll be painting on that. Because of course I want to use Alpha Lock. How could I forget? Let's use a Flotastic brush. I'm going to grab a green. Perhaps something like this. It's a bit too bluish. A bit too saturated. A little bit darker. I think this is a good start. Let's just drop it in. And now let's just paint a basic shape. And you can always tidy the lines later on. And you could also use the selection tool, make a selection with the freehand selection of the entire dress, the entire skirt, and then fill it. I somehow just like painting it in by hand, because at the same time I'm getting a feeling for the skirt, feeling for the painting. And for the color. Make it bigger. Now if it's a bit too transparent, then what you can do is actually just duplicate that layer a couple of times, then merge those, and you have a more opaque version. Make the brush a bit smaller. I want to tidy this edge a little bit. Sometimes it's hard when my iPad is lying down to be precise. I'm used to having it in my lap, actually. Alright, now let's turn on alpha lock so we are able to paint on top of this without going outside of the edges. I'm going to add some shadow areas. So let me pick this dark color. I need to go more desaturated. I think this is nice. I'll drop it in. And first I'll focus on the dark shadows. Just making these vertical strokes. You have pretty thin looking folds here. But it's really about a rough lay down of the shadows. I also want to grab a light color. Maybe like this. Yeah, I like that. Let me drop it in. Gonna add some highlights as well. Well, not really highlights, just the light areas. We don't have very distinct highlights in this skirt. I can see that it's definitely too like greenish, too saturated. I want to check what happens if I use the overlay brush. I'll set it to a warm color. That is becoming way too yellowish, maybe bluish. That's not it either. Gonna go for the warm one. Bit like this. Just for the base. Now let me lower the opacity of the sketch. And now let's use the smudge tool with the standard blender to blend everything a little bit. Alright, let me use the eraser. I'll use perhaps the smooth lines. Just want to clean this edge up. Just a little bit. Alright, now I want to deepen the shadows. Let's go back to the Flotastic brush back. And let me use the Flow Darker. I'll use this color that we picked earlier. I have the opacity at 50% and the size is at 20% at this time. But I really like playing around with that. And again, I'll focus on the deepest shadows. Slowly building it up. Sometimes I'll switch to the blending brush. It's already starting to look more like a skirt. I'm going to darken this side up a little bit. And just switching to the blending brush, to the smudge tool to blend. Alright, now I want to make crisper looking edges and areas. Let's lower the opacity of the sketch again. And now let's switch to the darken line brush. I'm not going very much up close because I need to stay zoomed out for this, since I have the reference over here. But that's nice because it's good to not get into too much detail. But in your case, when you are exercising, you can also use your reference in like the reference window in Procreate, or use a secondary window on your iPad. And I'm really also going for those smaller creases, smaller folds. I'm going to grab this local color so the shadow will become a little less dark. You can see that the light is coming from this side, so this is the lighter part of the skirt. And the shadows are a bit less deep here. I'm going to go back to the Flow Darker brush for a little more subtle shadow here. For those areas where you don't need a really crisp edge, you can use that Flow Darker brush. Make it nice and big. Add a subtle shadow here. And now let's go to the Flow Lighter brush. Oops. For some lighter areas. I do feel my skirt is definitely a bit too yellowish. Color is a bit off. Now let me use the eraser here. Cleaning that edge up. Well, it is looking like a skirt already. Let me try if I can add some blues to make it less yellowy. Use overlay again. Yeah, I think that's a bit better. Now I must say that I totally forgot to make little groups with steps in this case. I'm sorry, I hope you'll forgive me. Let me turn off the sketch layer. And yeah, we can refine a bit more. Let me use the eraser. I think it's best if you look at my other files in which I have been a bit more precise with my paintings. Feel like I'm rushing this a little bit. Maybe not being as tidy as I usually am. But you get the idea of how I'm using these brushes. Oh, getting rid of too much here. Perhaps I can do this. You can see it's a little bit messy here at the bottom. And at this stage, you can just keep refining. I'm gonna go back to the Flotastic brushes over here. I want to darken this area over here a bit more, because this fold is more going like this. So it's really about working from the big shapes to the small shapes, but I think I have said that in so many videos already. You can probably dream it. But yeah, big shapes to small shapes, little detail to more detail. Let me use the light and line brush just for some light edges here, for instance. I feel like I have a little bit of a shaky hand today. These are some light edges. So at this point, it's really about the smaller details, and you can go into as much detail, refine it as much as you want. But the best way to improve your fabric painting techniques, or any type of painting techniques for any subject, is to make these studies. Go to that Pinterest page that I've made, or go and grab your own references and do these studies, because it really helps. And if you're having trouble sketching, of course, if you're having trouble with the first phase, then go ahead and watch the sketching series. Now, overall, I think this is a pretty nice, still kind of rough looking skirt, but you get the idea. Let me just use a darker line brush for just a few tiny details, but overall, you get the idea on how you can create something like this. And look at those edges, of course. I can't stress it enough. Where do you see the soft transitions and where do you see the crisp edges? Painting fabric like this is a great exercise for that. Let's go ahead and move on to the next demonstration. The next exercise, you're going to draw this sweater. You know what? Let me just add the colors to this color palette. I'll just rename it skirt and shirt. Yeah, let's just call it skirt and shirt. Let's go to the study layer and let me turn on alpha lock. Let's grab a lighter color again and go for a bit bluish. Yeah. And then first we'll make the sketch again. We'll use clipping mask. Grab the Flotastic sketcher and a dark color. Let me just zoom out a little bit. First I'll measure. Here we have that elbow. It's going down here. I'm just gonna make the sweater. Won't be making the pants. It's just a big block of black. But we're gonna work on those big folds that we have here. This is a thicker fabric. We have that arm. You can see these nice thick folds here. It sure looks like a comfortable sweater. Right now I'm just trying to measure everything out using the techniques that we also use in the sketching classes. Looking at angles, sizes. We got a big fold here. If you're having trouble sketching, you do want to do the whole painting phase, you can always just use My Sketch. Grab it from the working file. It's all about exercising, so if it's the painting phase you want to practice with, then don't worry. You can always just grab My Sketch. Got all these folds here. Trying to make sense of them. Really trying to think about those shadow areas. You can see how the fabric is stretching a bit here from the elbow to the top area. And we got these folds here. Alright, now let's make a layer underneath to start painting. I want to lower the opacity a bit already of the sketch. Then I'll go to the Flotastic brush and let's grab a gray. Maybe something like this. Oh yeah. That's nice. Maybe a bit more bluish. I like that. I'll drop it in. And I'm just going to block everything in. Go along the edges. I just like the nice textured edge that the Flotastic brush gives. You can already see that this right side of that shirt, of that sweater, is very light. You can barely see the difference between the fabric and the background. Well, if you look on the left side, you can see shadow there. And you can see a way clearer distinction between the background and the shirt itself. So try to look at those values, how dark and how light areas are, and compare those different areas. Now let me duplicate it to make it more opaque. Then squish them together. And now let's turn on alpha lock so we won't be painting outside of our shape. So we got a nice mid-tone gray now, and we can add lights and we can add shadows. Let's start with some shadows. Perhaps something like this. Yeah, that's nice. And let's just add these little shadow areas. We have even dark. It should become darker even here. But let's just add these global shadow areas. Or the shadow area going up here. And I'm using a little pressure for some bigger, darker areas. Let me put it in the color palette before I forget. You never know. Right, we have that shadow here. And you can see that this area is a little bit darker than that. And you can see that it's already starting to take shape. With just a few shadow areas. A little shadow here. Now let's do the same thing, and then with a lighter gray. Maybe something like this. Yeah, that's nice. It's gonna block in some light areas. Let me drop that in as well before I forget it. And here on the right side, we have a lot of light spots. It's a lighter area. So now we already have that rough shape. Now let's go to the Flow Darker brush. I'll just pick that local color, make the brush a bit smaller. It's at 46%, and now I'm going to go over those darkest areas. Go even smaller, 25. And I'm gonna darken those darkest areas. So we're upping the contrast, making the shadows darker. You know, later we'll be working on the highlights again as well. Let's do the same thing with the flow lighter. I'll grab that. Don't want too much. And now let's use the smudge tool, set to the standard blender. And let's just soften some areas a little bit. And then we'll have a nice base to start using the darken line and the lighten line to add those final tweaks. This sweater, it doesn't need much. Now let's turn down the opacity of the sketch more. And now let's go and use the darken line for those crisp edges. Like here, we have a pretty crisp edge. And it's pretty dark there. And we'll want those crisp edges. Oh, that's a bit too big. We want those crisp edges to stand out nicely. Here we have a crisp edge as well. And here. And I can see some crisp edges over here. And here under that fold, we can refine that a little bit. Let's do the same thing with the lighten line brush. We can make this a bit more crisp, for example. You get some light edges. And this one. Now, if you want to refine areas, what I'd suggest is using the sorry, the basic flow brush. I like using that when I want to refine parts. We have all the colors right now, so you can just pick local colors and then go over areas where you need some refinement or where you want to darken areas. I feel like it gives a bit more control. You can make it nice and small for little details. Make it a bit bigger for large areas. But that's what I like to use when refining areas and just picking up local colors. But of course, this will be harder to do when you have like a lot of texture in your painting. Then you should really be careful with the basic flow brush, because when you start painting over stuff, you will lose the texture then. But it can definitely be used to blend a little bit, make softer transitions where it's needed. I'll grab that lighter color and lighten up this edge a little bit, for instance. Well, I think when we look from a distance, I think we have a pretty convincing sweater here. What we could do is add a little bit of texture. Let me think. I would think of a little noisy texture. Perhaps this. Let's see what happens if we use this brush. Just going over the entire area. Adding some noise. Let's grab a lighter. And you could also use this on a separate layer. I'll be sure to attach this brush to the post. But it just gives a nice subtle noise, giving it that little like woolly texture. Of course, you can use other texture brushes as well. Try to not add too much. You could, by the way, also add a little bit of an extra color. You can see some warm, like light in the shadow, a warm shadow. And you can add that by using the overlay brush, actually. Let's go to the basic set, overlay. Let's grab a bit of a warm color. Let me check. It's a bit too much. Make it a bit smaller, but you can go over that shadow area. Oh, it's still too much. My brush is too big. But you can go over that shadow area and add a little bit of warmth there. And it just gives that little subtle color variation. Let me drop this in as well, just to add a little bit more realism. And that's it for this Flows Fundamentals. I hope you have enjoyed it. I hope you'll go and do the exercises. If you have any questions, if you need to know more, please do ask. I am here to help. I have no secrets when it comes to my painting process. So whatever you want to know, please let me know. Please ask. And I will do my best to help you out. I'm looking forward to seeing you for the next Flows Fundamentals class. It'll be about painting trees. And for now, I'm wishing you a wonderful day. See you next time.